What's up, everybody? Welcome to Heresy Financial. My name is Joe Brown. I haven't made a video in a while. I'm finally back with you guys, and man, it is a pleasure to see the markets up, gold up, Bitcoin is back up from its bottom. We've got interest rates falling again. We've got people like Warren Buffett talking and warning about dire inflation. Man, a lot has happened since I've been gone, but you know what? It's good to hit the back roads every once in a while. It reminds us that Jerome Powell doesn't have the power to ruin everything just quite yet. But today we are going to be talking about what is actually happening in the labor markets. We're recently getting some news that the labor markets are coming back far faster than expected. We're seeing unemployment numbers drop. We're seeing an economic recovery. If you believe the major news headlines, we're seeing an economic recovery, jobs recovery that is robust, faster, stronger than anybody expected, leading many people to believe that massive GDP growth, economic strength, and prosperity is right around the corner. So what we're going to be looking at today is what is actually happening with the labor markets and how are companies actually hiring so many people right now to improve these job numbers so much right now, especially in light of what's been going on over the last year. So we're going to dive into the real numbers, see what's actually going on, and see if there are any investing takeaways that we can get from the actual job numbers. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, so the major headlines that we are seeing today are that U.S. weekly jobless claims dropped below 500,000 and that we have the lowest layoff levels since 2000. In 21 years, we've got the lowest layoff levels that we've seen. Now, this looks like, at first glance, fantastic news about the labor market, right? We've got a really strong labor market, really strong recovery happening right now. But we have to look at a couple different factors here. Number one, what does unemployment include? When you look at unemployment numbers, who's included in that? And then number two, we have to look at what is the labor force participation rate. Those are two very different things. And so we're going to take a look first at the labor force participation rate. To be included as a member in the labor force, you either have to qualify for one of two things. Number one, you have to have a job, or number two, you have to be looking for a job. That's it. If you are either looking for a job or you have a job, you are included in the labor force for the United States. And so to get the labor force participation rate, you're just dividing that into the number of American adults. Right now, we have an American labor force participation rate of just over 61%. Now, that's certainly better than what we had at the kind of the peak of unemployment right after the pandemic hit last year, which was just above 60%. But if we zoom out a little bit, we can see that this problem is not just something that we've been seeing happen over the last couple of months, couple of years. The United States has been on a downward trajectory in terms of its labor participation rate for decades now. In fact, the United States peaked at 67% back in 2000. Now, the reason why this is important to look at the total number of American adults and then divide that by the number of people who are actually looking for a job or already have a job is because of the people who stop looking for jobs once they can't find one. Because if you are not employed right now and you spent a certain amount of time looking for a job and applying for jobs and you were not able to get a job and so you've stopped applying simply because you don't have to right now because you're getting enough to live off of from government aid, you are not counted in the unemployment numbers. So let's look at that. What are the qualifiers for the unemployment numbers? The unemployment numbers start with the people who are already in the labor force. They don't look at the people who are outside of the labor force. So the unemployment numbers are looking at the people with jobs and the people who are looking for jobs. And part-time work does count as a job, even if that somebody who has a part-time job would rather have a full-time job. If you have an unemployment rate of, let's say, 10%, that means for every 100 people who are in the labor force, 10 of those are actively looking for jobs. Right now, the current unemployment rate is just about 6%. That number sounds great until you realize that's just a percentage of the actual labor force, people who are in the labor force. So the total number of people looking for jobs and the total number of people with jobs. It's not looking at the people who have stopped looking for jobs. And that's important right now because we are living in an unprecedented time in which somebody is giving people incentives to not work. When you consider all forms of unemployment aid, we've got about 16 million Americans who are collecting some sort of unemployment aid right now. Now, this has put our economy into a dynamic where the private sector is actually competing for jobs with the United States government. This is why employers aren't laying anybody off right now, because quite frankly, they can't find enough people to work right now. Both news on the streets from small businesses all the way up to large corporations, you're hearing the same thing, that companies simply cannot find enough labor or enough qualified labor to perform the jobs that they have open right now. Which means that right now the government is paying many people more to stay at home than they could earn from private businesses by going to work. Now, as with most things that happen in an odd way with the economy, you can usually trace that back to the Federal Reserve and easy monetary policy. And simply the fact that we've had such a massive expansion in the money supply over the last year, we've had this injection of capital into the economy that has sparked an enormous demand for assets, an enormous demand for goods. And as the economy reopens across the country and across the world, you're seeing an enormous spike in demand for services as well. And specifically in America, where we produce so little compared to how much we consume in relation to other countries, this is one of the things that is driving corporations to not be able to hire enough labor, because number one, they're getting squeezed on costs as inflation is driving up the prices of raw materials all across the board. But number two, they cannot produce enough stuff to keep up with the demand that all this new money is injecting into the economy. All the new demand from all this new money is causing. They cannot keep up with the demand from this, and so they're trying to hire as fast as possible. But part of the reason why they're not able to actually hire people to meet this demand is simply because of all that new money that's been pumped into the economy is causing people to stay at home instead of work. Now, if you watched my interview with Danielle DiMartino Booth, you heard me question her at length about the relationship between employment or unemployment and inflation, because she explains that unemployment is one of the biggest drags on inflation. And so if you want inflation, like let's say the Federal Reserve is actually serious and they actually do want inflation, and they're not just saying that because they know it's going to happen, solving unemployment is a big factor in being able to produce actual sustained inflation. And part of the reason for that is because you need money to be abundant for costs to go up. And if a massive percentage of the population can't get their hands on money, well, then you don't have the ability for inflation to happen, because money is scarce to most of the population. And so if unemployment drops and people have jobs and incomes go up and spending goes up, that's going to be a tailwind for inflation, whereas large unemployment numbers are going to be a headwind for it. Now, the counter argument to that is that if you have a reality like the one we're facing right now, where all of the deflationary forces of unemployment are offset by stimulus checks and unemployment aid, and people are still getting their hands on the money without actually having to work and produce for it, that's actually more inflationary, because now you don't even have the offsetting growth from the increase in production, increase in actual goods and services. You don't even have the offsetting growth to maintain a little bit of a level between prices and the supply of money. Now you just have an increase in the supply of money. And so what this is likely to lead to is a continuation of what's been happening, where the corporations and the companies who have the capacity will be forced to outcompete the government and continue to raise their wages until wages are at a point in which people say, hey, that's worth it for me to go back to work for that money instead of staying at home and collecting my government checks. The problem is most companies are small businesses and can't afford to do this. So it's going to shut out more and more small to medium-sized businesses from the economy, shut them down, and we're going to see more and more consolidation to the largest corporations who already have the capability to hire at higher wages. And either way, if that doesn't happen, and this is just a temporary spike in employment, and jobs numbers are actually not increasing and not improving long term, and they start to head back down, the political pressure to continue the unemployment aid will be far too high to be able to ignore, and they will continue that, which means that you're still papering over the deflationary forces of unemployment and causing inflationary pressures instead. And the final driver of this, which is probably not large, but it's worth mentioning, is the fact that we're seeing small isolated bubble dynamics pop up across the economy. We're seeing specific cryptocurrencies go through massive thousands of % increases in very short amounts of time. Before that, we were seeing certain stocks that were going through short squeezes, people making a ton of money on them. Before that, we were seeing a big bubble in new companies that were IPOing through the process called a SPAC, a special purpose acquisition company. And so over the last year, as people have had access to more money and more time to spend on non-productive activities that have the capacity to make the money, such as speculating, you tend to see these things start to happen together throughout history, whenever there's a massive injection of money, you have bubbles develop and you have people start devoting their time and their effort and their energy into speculative activities because you can make more money buying Dogecoin and sitting on it overnight than you can make by flipping burgers all week long. And so as, again, you trace this all the way back to the Federal Reserve and easy monetary policy, you have more money coming into a system, you start to develop bubble dynamics that pull human capital, that pull labor, that pull energy, that pull mental capacity out of the productive and private sector where you're actually producing something, and people spend more time doing things that might make them money short term, but are ultimately speculative and ultimately are going to harm society overall. Especially when some of these things that are full 100% speculation and just bubbles collapse in on themselves and destroy all the capital that people thought they were making along the way. So ultimately, what the jobs information and the jobs numbers, the unemployment numbers, the labor force participation rate, this is all looking very inflationary right now, because any amount of inflationary pressures that we're missing, that are not there, simply due to the labor force participation rate being so much lower than it has been historically and continuing down, that is all being papered over and will continue to be papered over by printing money and handing that out to people as helicopter money, which means that either way, we're getting a massive inflationary tailwind. And so until we see any sort of indication that intervention is winding down, that money is going to be pulled out of the markets, that they are going to increase interest rates, that the Federal Reserve is going to start trying to wind down its balance sheet or even stop increasing it, until we see any forces from the top that actively choose the painful option of something that has any sort of deflationary pressure to it, we're going to continue to see more of what we've seen over the last couple of months, which is prices go up. But we'll see. Currently, the United States is embarking on the largest monetary experiment in history, and so it's quite possible that through a roll of the dice, this all turns out to be just fine with no problems whatsoever. As always, I really appreciate you guys. If you liked the video, hit that like and subscribe button. Have a great day.